Hello and welcome to our roundtable research group event for the Anthracene Research Group with the New Center for Research and Practice. This will be a relatively short meeting, but we're really delighted to be here today with Mariah Brennan-Clegg, who is she's a member of the New Center and a journalist and a scholar in various fields, including political theory, sociology, and various other areas. And so she's currently in Paris, and we thought that this would be a good opportunity to get kind of a first-hand account. Mariah had posted some images and videos from the Paris Climate Conference while she was there. And one thing I noticed right away was that these groups were probably anarchist groups that were in the streets there and dealing with the police throwing some sort of explosives at them, tear gas and various things like that. So one way to think about the relationship, I guess, between theory and practice when it comes to political protests and kind of political gatherings like this is basically through what are the conceptual frames that the various groups that are assembled there are assuming, because obviously there is a kind of liberal environmentalism that basically wants to see reform within the existing system and kind of doesn't really assume that the fundamental structures of the existing system are really the central problem, and that very often in these types of protests is the vast majority of the people who end up showing up. Then you have people that are more, say, socialist or Marxist, who really emphasize capitalism over everything else. And then there are, of course, anarchists who would usually be opposed to capitalism, but also seeing power itself as a central problem, or domination or exploitation as a central problem, regardless of whether it's capitalist or not capitalist. And then there are other positions beyond those too. So I thought that maybe I would just start with just a really broad kind of overview, relatively quickly here, in which the concept of the Anthropocene has been put forward, and then also the Capitalocene, which Jason W. Moore has put forward, and then the critique of the Capitalocene from Mackenzie Wark. And most of us have read at least the Moore. Some of us have read the Wark as well. And just the idea with this is just to give, so that yes, we're dealing with like the empirical situation in Paris and kind of what's going on with the protests and that type of thing, but also at the same time trying to have some kind of theoretical lens through which to consider this. So basically more, and I'm gonna turn it over to Mariah in just a minute, but I just want to give a real brief summary of the two positions. So basically, Moore argues that the Anthropocene is kind of a Eurocentric, anthropocentric, liberal concept in that it ignores the basic human physical and mental processes that are also part of nature, that are also ultimately natural, and at the same time ignores the historical centrality of capitalism in the rise of every major item that Anthropocene theorists put forward. So as a result of that, instead of ending up with a politics that is thoroughly anti-capitalist and therefore is capable of addressing what has led to the Anthropocene, we kind of end up with a politics that is just not really. It really kind of like argues for, like, as he says, quote, small ameliorative reforms and that type of thing. And the response that we get from Wark is Wark argues that while this is an interesting argument and this attempt to think beyond the kind of binary approach of juxtaposing humans to nature, humanity to nature, and to replace that instead with capital versus nature, is an interesting approach and important because it's at least attempting to break down binaries. But for Wark, this still creates another binary, which is that between capital and capital in nature. Instead of human in nature, it's capital in nature. And for him, this is still kind of what he critiques as an ecological view, in which there's some sort of kind of primordial natural order of things. And so instead of that, his approach is basically to start from the move that is put forward by Moore originally, which is when he says, let's take a step back from this sort of binary oppositional thinking and start instead from the ways in which the human really already is a part of nature. And so kind of whatever is happening within the realm of the human is also already happening within the realm of nature. So it's kind of like Donna Haraway or Bruno Latour, and essentially what he wants to do is what Haraway describes as staying with the trouble, rather than doing the next move that is enacted by Moore, and kind of coming up with an alternative to human versus nature, which just becomes capital versus nature. So anyway, there's a lot to talk about here, and I'll turn it over to Mariah. I think you can see that there are a lot of different kind of political tendencies that would be persuaded by kind of the anthropocentric approach, or that would be persuaded by the capitalist-centric approach, or that might be persuaded by Work's approach, which is, I guess you could say Work's is more about power in general, rather than one particular type of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot. Oh, this is so weird. With the video feed, I can hear my echo. That's odd. Anyway, hi everybody, and thanks for having me today, or tonight, I should say. So I've definitely seen lots of these different viewpoints playing off of each other on the ground here in Paris. It's what's obvious to me more than anything is just how many different people are involved in this movement and how many different standpoints they come from and what they kind of see as the problem. This is particularly the case, I think, in kind of the inside versus outside the COP. So if you're familiar with COP at all, you know that inside Le Bourget, which is where kind of the conference center is, which is just a little bit outside of Paris, it's pretty much people who are appointed by heads of state and corporations getting together to figure out how to make money off of pollution, that kind of thing, and not really change the system. That's referred to as the blue zone. Just outside, there's the green zone, which is people who I would classify kind of as eco-modernists, who would definitely be, I think, the kinds of people who would be more in favor of the Anthropocene. They might say, maybe even not that far, but they're certainly not actually challenging structures. They're more challenging the particular ways that we work, that we usurp kind of nature for our benefit. These are the people who are saying, that we need to look to nuclear solutions. These are the people who are saying that we need to develop, hydrogen technology. They're the people who imagine these, these kind of futuristic kind of Star Trek-like utopias, right? And they've got this kind of like trade show going on that's just outside of the COP, but is still very much part of that same kind of mentality of trying to find technological workarounds to the climate crisis. Once you get outside of that arena and you get into like the actual city, like what's going on in Paris, it starts to look very different. Pretty much, I would say everyone who's on the outside of the COP, everyone who's gathered in the city for the to try to push for system change. They are pushing for system change, and I think these people would by and large agree that capitalism is the problem. At the same time, there are different levels of commitment to this idea, right? You've got. I went to a talk the other day with Naomi Klein. She's her very famous work. That's kind of that's sparked a lot of discussion surrounding what we would surrounding climate change. That it's capitalism versus the climate. She's willing to say that. At the same time, is she really? She's kind of she's really more against global capitalism than anything. I don't think she's against capitalism per se. She's against neoliberal globalized capitalism, but that's a different thing from being against capitalism itself. And she's certainly, I don't think, not critical enough of state power, and in fact relies on state power a lot in terms of trying to push forth, kind of changes to the capitalist system, right? And then you've got, kind of people who are, very much against capitalism, but they're not going to really say a whole lot about the state. And that's where I really saw things breaking down in the discussions surrounding the protests that I was at the Place de la République, which is where which is the video came from that Jason mentioned. So essentially, to give you, so does anyone have any kind of questions or any comments up to this point? Because if not, I'll launch into the discussion of the protest. But I want to make sure that I'm not assuming too much about what people know. All good? All right, cool. And then can everyone hear me and everything? Uh-oh, I can't hear you. Okay, well anyway. Great. So yeah, so what happened at the protest? We were going on November 29th during the day. The plan was to have a march, to have a peaceful march. That was the plan up until November 13th, when the terrorist attack happened. At which point the state, I think, seized on that opportunity to instate a state of emergency, which essentially means that people can't gather in large numbers, as long as they're, or rather, they can't gather in large numbers if it's part of a political movement. If it's part of kind of an event where you spend a lot of money, then you can totally gather. You can go to a football match, you can go shopping, you can go to the Christmas market, you can buy things, but you're not allowed to gather for a political reason, essentially. So we're barred from having this big march, and everyone's kind of figuring out what we're going to do instead, right? So we go to République, which is where the march was supposed to start, and everyone puts out shoes, pairs of shoes on the ground to symbolize the people who couldn't be there because of the restrictions on the number of people who can gather in the plaza, right? So, and the cops are already kind of lining up, and there are like 7 streets that all kind of meet at République. And it's very peaceful at first. Kind of starts off there like there's a whole like shoe kind of installation piece, I would say, and then it kind of becomes a dance party, and we start marching in a ring around the plaza, and we're kind of going down into these side streets, and the cops have barricaded all of the side streets, right? And it's almost like we're playing tag, like just going up and then kind of coming back and, seeing how far we can push them. And then, very suddenly, this huge mass of, like, the black bloc comes, right? And they just flood the streets. It was like they came out of nowhere. And they've got masks on, which you're not allowed to do in the state of emergency. In a state of emergency, you have to have your face revealed at all times so that people can identify you, right? And they really start pushing up against the cops. People start, things get a little bit tense. There's some shoving, and then tear gas starts going off. And then it devolved from there. People were picking up some of the candle, like the votives, like the glass votives from the memorial that was set up to in memory of the people who were killed in the terrorist attack, and hurling them at the police, and the police were throwing tear gas canisters and flash grenades back at us, and it got really crazy. All of a sudden, just as quickly as they'd materialized, the black mob was gone. And it was kind of too hectic to figure out, kind of where they went. And then we were all kettled for a few hours, probably 3 or 4 hours, before we were all kind of very quietly let go. They told us we were going to be put on a bus and shipped out, but they were kind of bluffing about that. Since then, it has kind of come out that that the black mob, that the people in the black mob were mostly police, right? So that and they were obviously trying to start some give the actual police, the police who are in uniform, a reason to arrest people. They were trying to get us to start a riot, but at the same time, like, there was definitely, in the discussion surrounding all of this, there was a big breakdown between people who were who thought that this was something that the violence of this protest was something that was going to hurt the climate justice movement, and people who feel like the state is very much implicated in the climate crisis, and that in challenging our system, we need to challenge not just capitalism, but we need to make it a more political matter, and we need to make it about challenging the state as well. I fall into that later category, but I feel like I'm in the minority on that front. So I guess I'll leave it at that and see if you guys have any questions, or if you want to discuss that, the state and capitalism and the climate.
How do you see that relating to? Because you told me that you also read a lot of like Ian Angus and that kind of stuff. And I know that's kind of more of a more Marxist perspective. Did you encounter many kind of? Was there like a Marxist tendency or like a socialist tendency as a presence at the protests, or was it mostly like liberals versus anarchists?
I would say pretty much everyone who's involved with kind of the like outside the COP perspective, like everyone outside the COP pretty much agrees that capitalism is part of the problem. I'm not sure, the varying degrees of how thoroughgoing Marxists they are, but I would say the vast majority of people outside the COP know that there needs to be real systemic change. And that's the kind of the big rallying call, or for people outside the COP, people who are in Paris like myself, is change the system, not the climate. It's so it's not just about trying to reduce emissions. It's not just it's not just about trying to find alternative energy sources. It's about protesting banks. It's about at the same time, I think that there could be a little bit. One thing that strikes me anyway is there's a lot of there's a big youth movement, and they're trying, and people in the youth movement are trying to say, this is our fight. This is we're fighting for our future. There needs to be more voices for the youth in this movement. And while I don't disagree with that, I think that does place the crisis into the future when it should be in the present. The climate crisis isn't something that we have to worry about because it's going to happen sometime out there. It's a crisis because it's happening now, and it's happening not just with the climate, but it's happening with labor, and it's happening with race, and it's happening with imperialism, and it's happening with sexism, and it's a right now crisis. It's not out there. It's not for the youth. It's for everybody. And I think that's maybe something that could be a little bit stronger in the rhetoric. But I would say that most people, in addition, are very aware that this is a problem that the global north has started. And in that sense, it tends more towards talking about a capitalist scene as opposed to an Anthropocene. I think most people on the ground here get that this isn't just something that's a human problem. It's a problem that was started by the global north that affects everyone, but particularly affects subaltern groups and people in the global south, and affects labor and that kind of thing.
So you read the maybe we can just go a little bit back and forth between the theory and the like actual.
Oh yeah, totally. I didn't mean to just like.
No, it's totally fine.
Word vomit on the yeah.
Okay. No, I was just curious, like, what you thought of, because you said that you read Ian Angus, so I was just curious, like, what differences did you notice between how Angus kind of approaches this question and how, say, Jason Moore does?
Oh, and how Jason Moore does. Hold on, let me get back to the text here.
I mean, either that or just what did you think of the Moore text? I guess be another.
Yeah, I definitely like the Moore text. He breaks it down in very similar ways. I would say that that Moore is very much influenced by Ian Angus, because they try to, but he's a bit more, it's a much more direct argument, but he's making similar points about what consequence-based kind of approach to when we place the Anthropocene. But I would say that Ian Angus goes into a little bit more of the anthropocentric argument, unpacking the reasons why we could imagine this to be a human problem, in the sense that humans have been, restructuring, the Earth's ecosystems for, thousands of years, and kind of problematizing the positioning this moment at the Capitalocene. I would say also, Ian Angus also tends to place the Capitalocene a bit later on. I want to say he focuses more on like kind of 20th century capitalism rather than the kind of the early modern capitalism that Moore talks about. But I tend to agree with Moore in terms of placing it at that moment, mostly because then we're talking more about imperialism rather than just kind of increased consumption, which is, I think, more Angus's focus.
Okay.
Mm.
I mean, that would be the basic topic that differentiates several political positions regarding the climate change. When did the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene in this case begun? You place at the start of let's say in general the capitalist mode of production or industrialization processes in 20th century, or even before, like others do, as Jason Moore says. I think kind of those different basic differences between narratives define in a very crucial way what political position we can have, right? That's very kind of let's say evident in this movement against climate change that you've been experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I think that people who are less, I guess, hardcore about the defining the Capitalocene tend to place it later. They tend to place it around mid 20th century, or maybe they'll place it at the steam engine, right? And by doing that, they're focusing on kind of the excesses of consumerism and the excesses of consumption, without really getting to the root of the I guess where capitalism and environmentalism kind of meet for me is that they're both just fundamentally extractive, and instrumentalist and alienating, right? That's what it is for me anyway. Beyond just the very basic, capitalism requires constant extraction and constant growth, and constant degradation of resources. But yeah. And then I think I do, and I think we're probably all in agreement here about this, but obviously when we talk about just the Anthropocene, we not only do we therefore kind of erase the unequal kind of blame, right? if we call it the Anthropocene, then we can say that it's a human problem, and we don't have to take any blame, as people in the global north. But that also means that we can't really solve the problem. If it's a problem with humanity, then there's no solution, there's no way out, and we can resign ourselves to whatever future lies before us, and we don't have to make any systemic changes because the problems aren't in the system, it's in our blood, which is a really dangerous way to look at it. And I forget whether the Moore article talked about that, but I think that's a really important point.
Okay, we have a response from Eric, and maybe he can articulate.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing I posted was more just like a quick note. I have a couple things like that, but actually, I wanted to start by well, I'll get those out of the way. So, just the CIF 15 is something that's happening on the 7th, and it's actually specifically business-oriented sort of subpart of the conference. I don't really know the details, but it seems to me like it's exactly like the perfect sort of target and platform and area for what you're doing. So it's very much that sort of like that, what you call that red circle, sort of tech business kind of solutions.
Mm-hmm.
It's purely a business that's around this somehow
on the 7th?
With the summit. Well, and then I'll ask the other thing later, but I wanted to comment on how you're mapping things out. So it seems like what you're saying, and this is just kind of parsing out the theory, I'm just sort of interested in how to discuss this, because part of the discussion for me is like how much are they in conflict and how much are they sort of mapping out complementary territories, or one's focusing a little bit more on this sort of more accelerated, more particularly Western, recent, technological, etc. sort of part of the Anthropocene, if you will. In what you were saying, you basically you're arguing that you want to sort of, in the vein of someone like Weber or someone who's sort of looking at capitalism in a macro scale, kind of like as it sort of grows out of mercantilism and is a sort of like 100-year, like hundreds of years sort of process. Is that sort of for you where it begins? Because I guess it seems like the three options we have here are, agriculture is one thing, right? And just sort of the beginning of this sort of manipulation of the world. Well, that starts the train wreck, and that starts this sort of process of, this sort of our building our own niche to the point that it's sort of a nihilistic process that it's going to undo ourselves. And the second one is, well, the European kind of version of that with all its technology, its science, it's sort of, I don't know, it's Christianity, it's navigation, whatever you want to throw into that, but this sort of like 1600s, 1700s. And then I guess what you were saying that Angus seems to be putting forward, which is sort of late capitalism, or, when you look at, the one thing I thought of in that vein was the CO2 readings. Actually, that's one thing that does fit in well with that. And I think there's a lot of ecological things where you can say, well, you're saying increased consumption, but also just that, yeah, maybe there is a tipping point in the sense that, there's a lot of sort of, how much are we getting really good data is always another question, but the CO2 readings is definitely something that's spiked in like the last half century,
Right.
And that starts to point towards, yes, we also have these sort of, these sort of ultra consumerist habits to sort of move, in a Baudrillardian fashion to the sort of consumer culture, not just production culture, but also that, yeah, the amount that we're affecting the environment, maybe has reached kind of a breaking point. I guess, well, this is just sort of rambling, but how would you situate maybe an argument against that? Like if I were to expand Angus's point to being more than just sort of, more consumers, more this and that, but the same basic thing, but that there is maybe something fundamentally different. I guess what maybe for you would be some of the key points to look into the early modern period ecologically speaking, in terms of environmental data or things that really start changing at that point.
Well, I guess that awesome. Yeah, that's great. I think one thing that makes me pause with kind of placing the Capitalocene in kind of late capitalism, or placing this like new geological era in late capitalism, is that it is a consequences approach, and Moore talks about that. And kind of the dangers of like if we just look at the consequences, then we miss where the root of the problem might really be. At the same time, it is there is something particular about, about this moment, that things really are, as ecological data shows, things really are getting a lot worse right now. So, so it might be beneficial to look at this age as, to look at the consequences of this age. At the same time, if we're, the consequences of I mean, there isn't as clear a delineation in terms of consequences if we look back at like the early modern capitalism than if we look even farther back. I mean, humans have been impacting their environment for thousands and thousands of years. Through a University of California at Santa Barbara, which is where I'm kind of headquartered right now, I've been auditing a course on literature and the environment, and they talk about how in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the great the first big victories for Gilgamesh is he kills the genus Loci, Humbaba, of this great cedar forest.
I remember this, and yeah, and then he gets in trouble. He's like, "Why are you killing him? Leave the forest guy alone." He just
the trouble. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's basically like how this story is told is or how it's explained in terms of like green criticism, eco-criticism, is like it's basically a cover story for like why those people were allowed to log this forest. It's like, oh well, Gilgamesh came in and he killed the this kind of this god of the earth, right? In the name of some metaphysical god, by the way, which is really interesting. But yeah, so he kills Zimbabwe and he's victorious, and then they can cut down the cedar forest and use the lumber. But the problem is that once they cut down that cedar forest, the rivers started to silt up, and thousands of people died because they didn't have because they couldn't farm the land in the same way that they used to be able to. They couldn't irrigate the crops in the same way that they used to be able to. So lots of people died. This is like one of the first man-made ecological crises. And then throughout human history, the first Clean Air Acts were written in the 1500s in England. To deal with all the with the coal pollution from fires because they deforested England, right? So we've been dealing with these problems for a long time. So it's hard to talk about. I mean, so when we think about consequences, I mean, we are kind of talking about like, all right, well, at what point does it become like, do the consequences become so huge that we finally have to deal with them? So those are some kind of issues with the consequentialist approach, I think.
Yeah.
I'm interested what you guys think about it.
Yeah. Just to add a point of info. So I guess to where it links up the two things we were talking about. It might have been like an eco-critical writer or something like that. But there's at least one version, one of the Babylonian versions, I think, where it's Enki or one of them. I think it might have been Enki.
Enkidu?
Sorry, go ahead.
Enkidu?
No, it's not Angus' buddy. It's not his half animal buddy. It's one of the guys. And I could just look it up, but anyways, it's someone, and he gets mad at, and so I feel like it was like an early eco-critical editor or something like that, and he castigates him. He gets mad at him, but there's that kind of. It's interesting because you've got. I don't know, in that sort of polytheistic mythology, you've always got this perspectival thing going on, right? And so you get that sort of like backlash within the story against the sort of, but the narrative that you laid out is definitely there, and then you've got that sort of, well, what does come out of it? And in some sense, there were groups at that time that were already, I guess, doing that, environmentalists, because that voice that he takes on is definitely that. But yeah, no, I see what you're saying, how it's sort of the engine starts in the early modern period, and then maybe we're seeing consequences, but that's not where we want to go for sort of like to problematize what's happening. The one final point I just wanted to say was, I don't know if there's any effect in what you're doing, but you guys might know, and this is just a general thing to bring up, about the Anonymous's leaks on the of a whole bunch of people involved in the summit. I don't know if that's an aid or not, but I just thought it was a pretty big news item that I don't know. I mean, like so much of this sort of leak stuff, it's not necessarily activist, but it potentially is insofar as it, it just opens up so much, and who's actually interested in that sort of information, and not having that information out, it tends to be, so I'm just curious, from your guys' perspective, has it been, at all beneficial or related at all to anything that other people are doing, that you're doing? That...
I'm so sorry. Do you mean the like the leaks of like the corporate sponsors, like who's involved in that capacity? Or I might not be familiar with.
Let me just link it so that I can. Yeah, let me just.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just give me a second.
It's kind of funny because like I'm like here, but there's a lot about the COP that I'm not hearing about because I'm doing like I don't know. I've mostly been just to give some context, I'm mostly here making a documentary about the different activist projects.
Sorry,
yeah,
what is the doc about?
About different activist approaches to COP21. So because I became really interested in how people were and how the police were going to respond to activism, and whether people were going to try to push back against that. And I'm particularly interested in Gustavo Esteva's like theory of like joyful militancy and sad militancy, which is sad militancy kind of being like vanguard kind of or like trying to create like ideologies and trying to fight power, but using their language, right? Versus joyful militancy, which is creating art and dancing and creating alternative spaces where people can rehearse new ways of living, right? So I'm kind of interested in that. And oh yeah, sorry. Do you have the thing? Oh, cool. Let me see. Redirecting. I guess I don't need to look at this right now.
Yeah, if you don't know,
honestly, I'll take a look at this later.
Yeah, but I'm,
but that's really great though. I would say, and I can't speak for everyone outside who's on the outside of the COP, but pretty much everyone I know on the outside has zero faith that anybody inside the COP is going to do anything other than what they've been doing for 20 years, which is kick the can down the road, make non-binding agreements to insufficient changes, essentially. Yeah.
Can I just raise a question here of a question of?
Oh yeah.
So one question that arose for me looking at the Jason Moore text is that he basically says that this anthropocenic approach basically leads to kind of like an agenda of small scale, not just small scale, but small ameliorative reforms. And to me, the kind of the opposite of that type of approach is basically like a larger scale, kind of more Promethean politics that would try to change things on a much larger scale. And I think with something like climate change, it's really not something that can be addressed just by local communities or by buying local or even rescaling economies just to the local. I just don't think that is going to be enough because of how deeply into climate, the climate crisis we currently are. Not to mention where we will be soon. So if we're that deeply into it, I mean, one kind of strange juxtaposition I see here is I don't mean from you, but I mean from like that I just sort of see kind of playing out, it seems like, is that on the one hand, like this is a UN conference, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's like a United Nations conference, which is the largest kind of global body and attempt, an earliest attempt to really, other than like the League of Nations, but one of the first attempts to create some type of a global governance structure, even if it's not a global state, it's still some attempt at global governance beyond mere nationalism.
Right.
And so and beyond localism. So I guess the part that I'm thinking of is, to what extent would you say the general feeling there is one of kind of that the way to address this is actually at the global level, even if not through the UN, maybe through some other thing that becomes created, perhaps from the activist movements and things like that. But definitely, to my mind anyway, the scale of the UN is the correct scale for dealing with something like climate crisis. But the approach is not the correct approach because it's sort of liberal ameliorative reforms. So I'm just saying, because I remember during the anti-globalization movement, there were, and I was persuaded by this early on myself, there were a lot of people who basically said, no, when we say anti-globalization, we really do mean anti-globalization. Like we really want power to be restored back to local communities, and we think that that would, maybe if combined with an anti-capitalist politics or something, would be basically sufficient. So I'm just wondering, like, to what extent is there kind of a left globalism, like a radical globalism that you are hearing about, or are you mostly hearing about kind of left localism?
I'm definitely hearing more of the left localist side. I think people are wary of. I think the problem with like UN scale approach is that it centralizes things too much. It pretends that there's no hierarchy between the global north and the global south. It universalizes a procedure that is rooted in the West, and it's hard to shake that. I think people are much more interested in going back to local spaces and trying to create alternatives to capitalism and alternatives to the state on the local level in these little in these small movements. They go by lots of names, all over the world. Whether it's like Blockadia is one that Naomi Klein talks about a lot, and other people as well. But the ZAD, the ZAD, which is the Zones à Défendre, which is where have you guys heard about, quick show of hands, Ende Gelände? Okay, cool. It's awesome. You guys should check it out. John Jordan is one of the big people who's kind of involved in this. But basically, people going to sites of extraction and defending that area with their bodies, and in the process setting up alternative communities and rehearsing the big kind of questions of political theory and sociological theory. How do we make decisions collectively, and how do we set up society imminently decentralized, bottom to bottom, but anyway, so it is very much rooted in the local. But I'm definitely interested in how these different groups have been able to connect to connect globally, but in a decentralized way. And I think that's what people are looking for. But it is definitely the phrase is thrown around a lot. It's a soil-based approach. It's people connecting with the land, connecting with other people on the land, and reaching out. But it's almost like, Jason, you'll remember our lunches at Papa Charlie's back in Williamstown. But it's about resonating with other groups, but not pretending like we're under one big tent. And I think that's what you risk with a UN type forum. But the biggest thing, I think, is not to try to solve climate change by working through existing power structures. It's about setting up alternatives so that we don't have to just talk about tearing stuff down. We can talk about building up alternatives so that we don't need this other shit.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess
that's a really long-winded response. Sorry.
No, that was good. I guess my hesitancy is that I guess I would worry that could lead to a type of return to nationalism. And I mean, there are historic connections between environmentalism and nationalism, and certain forms of fascism that were basically, you know, pro-ecological. And so, to me, like, any type of ecological thinking or action today would need to worry about that a little bit. You know what I mean? And not to say, and the idea wouldn't be that the alternative is the UN, but that, like, basically the only thing the UN is doing right is that it's operating on the scale of the actual crisis. The crisis is a global crisis. It's not a local crisis. So, at least as I see it, it's a global crisis, and therefore it demands a global response. And some sort of, I think Paris, even if the people aren't thinking of what they're doing as being a left globalism, to me it still seems like that is basically what is functionally happening, you know, more or less in Paris.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thanks, by the way, for the comment. I would say so. I think in response to that, I think maybe, and tell me if I'm wrong, because it's totally possible. But the kind of fascist nationalist kind of discussions about, or kind of interpretations of environmentalism, would that kind of be like a, not to reduce it too much, but would that be like a not in my backyard kind of thing, where like you're trying to protect your area? Is that kind of...
No, it has more to do with like sort of the naturalization, like the ways in which discourses of nature become connected with basically discourses of like who naturally belongs where, and like who are the stewards of this land, kind of thing. Like who are supposed to be the stewards of North America, for example? Is it the kind of I mean, is it Native Americans? Is it recent immigrants? Is it old stock Americans? You know, this is where race and nature and nationalism start to enter the discourse a little bit. And the Sierra Club,
I see what you mean.
Yeah, and like the Sierra Club, for example, is you know, advocated a number of anti-immigrant policies and things like that. But my point here isn't at all to like denigrate, you know, what's happening in Paris or the environmental movement. It's just I don't know. I just remember during the anti-globalization movement, there was a tension between basically the North American version, which was where most people were saying, no, we really do mean anti-globalization, and then the kind of European and Latin American and other regions which use the term alter mondialisation, meaning like alter globalization rather than anti, so that it would still be pro-globalization, but it would be a kind of like the globalization of justice, basically.
Yeah, I mean,
it actually came out of France. So part of me is just slightly curious. Like, are you seeing any tension? I mean, are you seeing like more than one tendency represented there? Like, are there people who are calling for alter globalization at all, or are those people mostly just UN type people?
You might say like a form of that. Kind of where I was going with the not in my backyard thing is that another rallying call is not in anyone's backyard. Oh, you went away. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so it is definitely about looking out for everyone's soil, like realizing that you're rooted that everyone is rooted in a place. But honoring the fact that everyone is, so it's about and a big part of it is about saying no to sacrifice zones, because that's the way that capitalism works. That's how extractivist capitalism works. That you can we over here can extract resources from over there, and it doesn't matter because they're a sacrifice zone. They're they're brown typically. They're poor. that's how environmental racism works. And there is definitely a tendency for particularly groups of privilege to look at other areas of the world and say, all right, if I wouldn't allow this in my backyard, then we can't allow it over there either. So there is that tendency, I would suppose. But I think that's the biggest expression of kind of like ultra globalization that I've seen. But people, I think people are thinking of this as kind of a problem. They're definitely thinking of it as a problem for the global community, but I think that the tendency is for people to think of it as something that is that we need to fight for on the ground where we are. So there is kind of a local focus, if that helps at all.
Yeah, I mean, that can still be global if it's global in the sense of think globally, act locally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
We had a question here from Philip Sherhart, who says,
yeah.
Has there been an increase in left theory regarding strategies and tactics of movement? Have you heard? In other words, have you heard? Like the reaction that you mentioned against the Black Bloc, for example. Mm-hmm. That's something that is often, of course, that it often is stated that the Black Bloc is nothing but police provocateurs. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, the reality is sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I mean, there are people who think that there needs to be a militant, absolutely militant response to and so sometimes it will be and sometimes it won't be. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, and maybe what Philip is asking, or I'm trying to relay what Philip is asking, but I'm also partially remembering my experience in Seattle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know. Have there been calls to be only nonviolent and to not do anything other? There have. Okay.
Absolutely, there's been a huge. I think I've seen it on the ground a lot more than I've even seen it on Facebook. And, like, obviously, my Facebook friends are going to kind of be sympathetic to my aims, but, I have a diverse friend group, so lots of different people could be getting. But anyway, so I posted this video, and just about everybody outside of Paris has responded really, like, in a very excited tone towards what happened at République. Everyone I talk to on the ground is very critical of it. And I would say disappointingly so, in a way. Not that, I consider myself a pacifist, but I consider myself a pacifist in terms of, like, state violence. I don't believe in war, but that's state violence. I think there's a big difference between the state's use of total absolute power and imminent non-hierarchical violence. Again, like, I'm probably not going to be the person, throwing glass at the cops, but I'm not going to necessarily deride people who do. But there has been. Sorry, what are people on the ground critical of? Sorry. République, which is the sorry. I'm talking about République, the protests and the violence that occurred there. But yeah, people are definitely there's been a big backlash. I talked to people who said, I totally understand that France is in a state of emergency. There was a terrorist attack, and they should be on guard, and we shouldn't test them. I haven't talked to anybody who's at all in favor of violent protest, which is it's good. It's good that people are trying to transcend state violence and try to confront the police on kind of in terms that in a language that they can't speak. The police can't speak in the language of humanity. They can't speak in the language of love or art. And I think it's really important to confront them, to confront the police on terms that they can't match. At the same time, I'm not going to preclude, having having violent altercations with the cops, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily morally wrong with that. I don't think that there's anything morally wrong with picking up the votives of the that were laid out for the terrorist victims and throwing them at the police, because that's exactly what they did. The state took the memory of the people who were killed in the terrorist attack and used it as an excuse to set up this the state of emergency. And I think it's a really poetic act to throw those votives back at the police. I'm the only person I've talked to who thinks that.
You should totally write something on that. That would be so interesting.
I just sent it to Charlie Birch.
Oh, you did? Oh,
yeah. I'll send it to you as well.
Oh, good.
I'll send it to the group. Yeah. Yeah,
cool.
It'll be fun.
You know when that's going to be published?
I have no idea. I just sent it an hour ago. And I've been getting about, like, by the way, if I'm, like, going crazy or anything, it's probably because I've gotten, like, 5 hours of sleep a night since I've been here. Tops. but yeah.
One more thing I just wanted to touch on with
oh, please, yeah.
Philip's question was just this was another question I had percolating in the back of my mind for a while. Okay, actually, by the way, I know John Jordan. I stayed with him in London.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I stayed with him in London in 2004 when I was traveling Europe. So.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
Because I met him in Seattle.
You're like my favorite people. No, John, yeah. I mean, okay, I've never met John Jordan, but it is.
Oh.
I'm making, like, I kind of want to make my documentary about trying to find him, because I know he's in Paris and I know he's doing cool shit.
Well, I'll connect you on Facebook for sure. If you're. Yeah, I'll connect you on Facebook. But the question I had was, this is something that he brought up in an article where he was interviewed for about what was happening in Paris, and he said, and this made me think of like Agamben and the state of emergency type of discourse and that sort of thing. And there's actually a quote by Homi Bhabha where he's responding to Benjamin's articulation of the state of emergency, where he says, the state of emergency. You remember in Benjamin, he says, the state of emergency has kind of always been the case for oppressed people. It's only for non-oppressed people when a state of emergency seems like a sudden shift, and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
But Homi Bhabha.
I mean, look at Beirut, Paris.
Yeah. But Homi Bhabha responded, and he says, the state of emergency is also a state of emergence. It's always, even though the state may try to clamp down, there's still, even within that framework, there's still room for movement and kind of wiggle room and moments of potential resistance that can happen. So what John Jordan said was, he said something like that what the protesters are doing they're trying to figure out, okay, there has been this declaration, but at the same time they were trying to figure out ways to sort of figure out exactly what the state of emergency declaration states, so that they could figure out how to kind of get around it and still be able to do what they wanted to do, but also maybe do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done. And I guess that's kind of the rapture thing with all the shoes and stuff like that. But are there other examples you can think of that, like ways that the protesters dealt with the fact that there was a state of emergency that had been declared in kind of a creative, tactical way?
I suppose more than anything, there have been workarounds. What comes to mind is, first of all, putting the shoes out in the plaza, and what that turned into, people left their shoes out, and those shoes were donated, which I thought was I guess that's kind of the closest way that they've found a limitation and seen and figured out how to grow from it. Other than that,
there was also the projection too, right? Like there was a projection of people on some parliament building or something.
Oh God, I'm not. There was. Do you know what day that happened? I personally didn't.
I think it was before you got there. I think it was like.
Okay. Yeah, because then there was also because there was another action at the Eiffel Tower, but there have been kind of like placeholders for people. The other thing that it happened the same day as the protests at Republique, but it was the human chain, and they were linked such that they were like far enough apart so that the cops couldn't bust them, right? So and like thus like taking up more space because of that limitation. But I'm definitely interested. But that's exactly right. What I'm really interested in seeing is how people are going to respond in creative ways that make their movements more powerful because of this crisis. But I would say that everyone is very everyone's kind of made timid by the police. I think there is a bit of a sense of, oh, there was just a terrorist attack, we should be sensitive. Or, the cops are going to be out, we have to be careful. And, on the one hand, it's disappointing. On the other hand, on another hand, I get it. Like the first night that I was in Paris, I was almost deported.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, like I was in the kettle with, for 3, maybe 4 hours, with, and it got down to where it was just like, people kept giving themselves up, and, then it got down to be like 100 people, and, I've been in Paris for 1 day, and I'm an American citizen, and, they don't want troublemakers, so, and people don't want to get deported. I'm staying with somebody who's a British citizen who's studying abroad in the U.S. If he gets arrested in France, then he gets deported from the U.S. So I realize that I kind of come from a position of privilege where, even if I get deported from Paris, like, not that big a deal. It is a big deal for some people.
You're not going to go to jail when you get back or anything.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I'm excited to see how it unfolds. I'm excited to see December 12th, which is kind of going to be the redlining day. So if you're familiar with any of John Jordan's stuff, the idea is to create red lines around. I mean, they're kind of symbolic and hopefully going to be physical as well, but boundaries that we will not allow corporations or states to cross. Creating boundaries around the things that we love, the things that we need, the resources that we need, and the idea that they are crossing lines that should not be crossed, mm-hmm. by continuing to emit what they're emitting. So hopefully there are going to be some actions surrounding that. One idea that's been thrown around is barricading people, the negotiators, inside the conference halls until they come to a real agreement, or if there isn't, or refuse to sign on to something that's a false agreement. That's one that I really like. So hopefully, as things ramp up, as we get towards the end of the towards the end of the conference, I think people are going to be more radical. Right now, everyone's pretty timid, I would say.
Okay.
But being creative within that, one of my favorite moments. So I know we're running late on time. Sorry, but I've been hanging around at this art place called Jardin d'Alice, which is a squatter's art space in Montreuil, and it's basically they have a kitchen there. They have 3 meals a day, food on donation, and this huge art space with art supplies and paint, and it's open to anybody who wants to come in and make anything they want. And there's a group of people there who are at a protest today, and I've been running into them a lot at this art space. And they've got an accordion and they're saying Bella Ciao, and they're juggling in front of the cops, and it's a really positive atmosphere. So there's lots of cool stuff going on. Oh, yeah. Here, I'll type it. How do I type on this thing? This is crazy.
You just put your computer in the little box at the bottom there?
Blocks at the
Oh.
bottom?
Yeah. Okay. Take your cursor and scroll over the upper left corner where you see the green box.
Oh!
And then
wait.
click that.
This? Is that? Oh, okay. Oh my god, people have been typing messages and I haven't been reading them. I'm so sorry. Jeez. Alright. Jardin de Lys, and that's in Montreuil. And there are tons of these places all over. The coolest thing. I want to live in one of these places. They're dirty and they're vibrant. And on the bathroom stalls, they've got where they've blocked it. They've crossed out the gender sign, and it's got an anarchy A and then a and kind of all-encompassing gender symbol. It's just such a positive place. It's awesome. Cool. I'm excited about stuff like that too, but yeah. So by the end, you might see me in a black mob. So, or rather, not see me.
Does it seem like there's an increase in squatting going on?
I don't really have a whole lot to compare it to, because I haven't been in Paris for long. There have been there are lots of people who've come to Paris and who've come for the COP but don't have a place to stay. So, and they've been staying at these squatters' places. So in that sense, there's an event, so more people are squatting. But I'm not sure if there's been. I'm not sure if this is like a secular trend or one that's just kind of like if it's just going to be a blip on the screen. But definitely more people are using these spaces because they're not just using these spaces now for a cheap meal. They're using them to create big things kind of en masse. But they're very exciting. There's a place in Santa Barbara that where I'm living right now that reminds me a lot of it, and I can't wait to get back there and work on it. But yeah, very very cool places. Again, people creating alternatives so that I don't really. Yeah, I am staying in a house actually, but if I were staying in a hostel or something, I could go out and buy food somewhere that's not sourced well and is expensive, or I can go to Jardin de Lys and I can to this art space and I can pay anything I want basically for a plate of vegan food that's organic and is made by people who are awesome. So, creating alternatives, I like it.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, any closing remarks from Daniel? I'll just go through the line, so I'll start with Daniel.
I would just say that it's very interesting, the experience you're kind of engaging in, and I hope we can hear a lot more about you in the coming days. Keep posting your videos. Very interesting.
Great.
Yeah. If there's other initiatives all around the world, well, I'll be sure to be looking it up to participate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Eric, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, not really, but this was really nice, and it was a really great discussion and really great to. Anliel was the guy who got pissed. I didn't remember at the time.
I saw your comment. Yeah.
Okay, so you could kind of see comments, or kind of not, or just sometimes.
They would come up, but sometimes I just couldn't think.
Oh, so they would come up temporarily, but you didn't see the column, or okay, yeah. All right.
Now I know how to work it properly, somewhat.
Cool. No, this is awesome. I appreciate you doing this, Jason, and it was really nice hearing all your experiences and stuff, Maria. Is it Maria? Is that right?
Mariah.
Mariah?
Close enough. I'll answer to anything with an M. I'm not picky.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't mention it first, but Mariah was my student at Williams College when I was there, and I was teaching political theory. And was definitely one of the more radical and kind of excited political theory people for sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cool to still be working with you and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. This has been great. Thank you, and I really I appreciate you guys so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about my experiences, and it's great to be able to work through some of these questions for myself, because it's I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been talking to lots of people. And it's great to get different people's perspectives and people who are more radical. I'm with great people. They're all super radical, but you guys are more radical. This isn't like recording for posterity, is it?
It is, yeah. But that's so then
Perfect.
Philip says, keep us in the loop about your documentary. Sounds interesting. I appreciated the grounded discussion and the weave of more in the Capitalism versus the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Can I so I actually I've written a little bit about kind of what I talked about today in terms of my interpretations of the Capitalism and the Anthropocene. Should I send that as well as the draft of my my paper on Republic onto you guys?
Yeah,
cool.
Please.
Awesome. Will do.
Yeah, you can just send it to the Anthropocene research group, or just like post it there. There's a place in the group that says at the top where you would just write something or put a link. It says add file. So
great.
Just click add Word documents or whatever you want, or PDFs, whatever.
Cool, awesome. That's great. Yeah, I've got it all on Google Docs, but yeah, I'll send it your way, and yeah, this is so great. Thanks so much for sharing your time with me, you guys, and keep up the good fight, everybody, on all fronts, intellectual and otherwise.
Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot, you guys. Bye.